AirTransat Airlines Flight 236 was heading from Toronto to Lisbon. It was midnight, and the plane was cruising at an altitude of 39,000 feet in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. This situation was routine for the pilots, and there was nothing abnormal about it, but there was one thing on the plane that would change everything in a matter of moments. Welcome back to Voyage Vault. Let me tell you that from 39,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, the Earth is not visible even from a distance. Suddenly, the captain realized that the plane's fuel was about to run out. This was a terrifying situation for both pilots because running out of fuel over the Atlantic Ocean has only one meaning, and that is death. Friends, this incident occurred on August 23, 2001, at Toronto Pearson Airport. An Airbus A330 of AirTransat Airlines was being prepared to depart from Toronto to Lisbon. This was a 7-hour nonstop flight, and for this reason 48 metric tons of fuel were loaded, and after preparation, the boarding process began. At that time, according to local time, it was 9 p.m. Flight 236 carried 293 passengers and 13 crew members, including 2 pilots. The flight captain was 48-year-old Robert Pish, who had 16,000 hours of flight experience. The first officer was 28-year-old Dirk de Jager, who also had 5,000 hours of experience, including 400 hours flying the Airbus A330. The Airbus A330-243, manufacturer serial number 271, registered as CGITS. The aircraft had its maiden flight in 1999 and was delivered to AirTransat on April 28, 1999. The aircraft was just over 2 years old and was equipped with 2 Rolls-Royce Trent 772B-60 engines. Putting it all together, neither the pilot's experience nor the aircraft had any shortcomings. After completing all flight checks, the pilots took Flight 236 to the runway and with ATC permission took off. After takeoff, the pilot headed the plane toward Lisbon across the Atlantic Ocean. Within minutes, the plane reached its cruising altitude of 39,000 feet. Typically, pilots have less work on long flights since most tasks are automated by the autopilot system. Pilots primarily monitor the situation and keep the control tower informed of their location and updates. For hours had passed since Flight 236 took off, and everything was normal. Most passengers were asleep in the cabin due to the late hour. The plane had reached the center of the Atlantic Ocean when a problem arose. At 1 a.m. Canadian time, the pilot noticed an abnormal reading in engine number 2, the plane's right engine. The engine showed excessive oil pressure, low oil quantity, and low oil temperature. This error was unprecedented for the pilots in their careers. They immediately opened the flight manual and tried to understand the cause of this unusual issue. Normally, oil temperature increases with time during flight operations, but here it was indicating low temperature, which was far from normal. They couldn't find any information about this error in the flight manual. The pilots contacted AirTransat's maintenance unit in Canada and informed them about the error. Unfortunately, the maintenance unit was also unaware of this error. They asked the pilots to continue monitoring the situation, and they would contact them again shortly. Although the right engine of the plane was showing faulty oil readings, there was no problem with the flight. The pilots relaxed, thinking that perhaps a faulty sensor was giving incorrect oil readings. But half an hour later, another advisory message appeared before the captain. This message was not related to oil, but to fuel. Commercial airliners distribute fuel evenly in their wings, and it was noted that Flight 230 SIX's 2 wings did not have equal fuel. The right wing had less fuel than the left. Normally, this issue wouldn't be serious, as it can be fixed during flight. The captain opened the crossfeed valve to fix the problem, allowing fuel to flow from the left wing to the right, and within minutes both wings had equal fuel quantities. Only 10 minutes had passed when the captain started seeing low fuel warnings. This was a problem no pilot wanted to face, especially with a passenger-filled plane. The pilot saw that the right wing's fuel had decreased again, and even with both wings combined, there wasn't enough fuel to reach Lisbon. This time the situation was serious. Diverting the plane in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean didn't leave many options. In fact, they had only one option: the Azores Islands. These islands are part of Portuguese territory in the Atlantic Ocean, where the island of Terceira has an airport. The captain immediately contacted Santa Maria ATC and informed them that they would land at this airport due to fuel shortage. However, the pilot was still unsure if they could reach the airport or would have to land in the ocean. At that time, 7 tons of fuel remained in the plane, equivalent to approximately 7,000 kilograms. While it seemed like a lot, it was only 6% of the A330's fuel capacity, and it was rapidly decreasing. The question was, why was the fuel really decreasing? Was it another faulty sensor giving incorrect readings, or was there an actual fuel shortage? The only possible reason for the fuel shortage was a leak somewhere. To investigate, the captain instructed the flight crew to monitor the wing's trailing edge, the rear section of the wing. If fuel was leaking, they would likely find an indication there. However, due to the darkness, the crew couldn't spot anything. The condition was critical. Every 5 minutes, 1 ton of fuel was being consumed. The captain was now certain that fuel was leaking somewhere. With only 25 minutes worth of fuel left, reaching Terceira Airport was impossible. Meanwhile, the captain and first officer were in constant contact with the maintenance unit and ATC. The maintenance unit instructed the captain to descend from 39,000 to 20,000 feet to confirm the fuel leak, but the captain refused. He believed that even if the leak was confirmed, it would be impossible to regain altitude. At least at 39,000 feet, they still had the option to glide. In the next few minutes, all doubts vanished when a fire erupted in the right engine of the plane. Chaos broke out on board, and passengers who were still sleeping peacefully were suddenly enveloped in fear. The plane now had only 4.5 tons of fuel and 1 engine left. Cruising on this single engine was impossible, so the plane began to gradually lose altitude. Meanwhile, an emergency was declared at Terceira Airport, and fire brigades and emergency crews prepared for all possible scenarios. The plane, still 240 kilometers away from Terceira, had only 600 kilograms of fuel left. Then, the unthinkable happened. The left engine, running at full throttle, failed, and Flight 236 began gliding over the Atlantic Ocean without engines. Here, the captain's decision not to descend to 20,000 feet proved correct. With both engines shut down, darkness fell inside the plane since the engines power the electrical system. Fortunately, the automatic turbine generator kicked in, producing enough electricity to power critical cockpit instruments. Now, Terceira Airport was 120 kilometers away, and the plane had descended to 30,000 feet. The captain had to cover this distance solely by gliding. The passenger cabin was shrouded in darkness and an eerie silence, punctuated only by the sound of dripping silence, creating an atmosphere of fear. The worst-case scenario was that if the plane couldn't reach the airport, it would have to make an emergency landing in the ocean. Therefore, the crew began preparing passengers for water landing. Ocean landings are extremely hazardous, as even if passengers survive the impact, they risk drowning or succumbing to hypothermia from the cold water. Normally, gliding a passenger plane without engines is extremely challenging. Everything depended on the plane's pitch control, which the pilot was manually adjusting with a control stick. The plane's altitude was dropping at a rate of 2,000 feet per minute, meaning it would either reach the airport or crash into the ocean within the next 15 minutes. When the plane was 15 kilometers from Terceira Airport, its altitude was 13,000 feet, whereas normally it should have been around 3,000 feet at that distance. If the pilot had dived to reduce altitude, the plane's speed would have increased significantly, making a crash landing highly likely. Instead, the pilot made the plane turn 360 degrees. After completing the turn, the distance from the airport remained the same, but the altitude had dropped to 5,000 feet. Although this was still higher than ideal, making another 360-degree turn was not feasible. The pilot then aligned the plane with the runway and made a few S-turns. These S-turns increased the distance from the runway, allowing more time to lose altitude. Typically, during landing, flaps are extended to create drag, and engine thrust is increased to lift the plane's nose. However, Flight 236 had no engine thrust, making this landing vastly different and extremely hazardous. The pilot had only one chance to land the plane. It was now or never. Finally, the plane touched down on the runway with a violent jolt, and 8 of its 12 tires burst. Stopping the plane was challenging, but it eventually came to a halt. As it stopped, a fire broke out in the landing gear, which the airport crew quickly brought under control. Flight 236 became the first and only passenger plane in aviation history to hold the record for gliding without engines for the longest time. During the investigation into the fuel leak in the right engine, it was discovered that the maintenance crew in Toronto had replaced an engine part before takeoff. However, the part belonged to another plane. The loose fitting caused vibration, which ruptured the nearby fuel line. Following this incident, Airbus installed a new system to alert pilots to fuel leaks during flight. A year later, Captain Robert Pish and First Officer Dirk de Jager received the Superior Airmanship Award for performing a dead-stick landing on an Airbus A330.